The first thing Aiko noticed was the smell metal, iodine, and salt. It clung to the corridor like a ghost of war that refused to leave. Outside, the ocean licked the harbor wall in slow, exhausted breaths. Inside, the U.S. Naval Hospital buzzed with a language that wasn't hers. Orders barked in English. The shuffle of boots, the cough of wounded men. She moved through it like a shadow in white. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried a tray. Gauze rolls, antiseptic, a chipped porcelain teacup filled with water. The hallway light flickered. A radio somewhere played a faint tune, "Don't Fence Me In." Aiko Takeda had learned to understand most words by rhythm. Commands were sharp. Pity was soft. She didn't need translation for either. When she entered Ward 7B, a dozen eyes followed her. The men on the beds were Americans, sailors from a ship that had limped into port 3 nights ago after an explosion in the engine compartment. Some had burns, some shrapnel. One had lost half a hand. They were alive, but barely. Aiko bowed slightly before she spoke, her English careful, low. "Good morning. I will change dressings." Private Hawkins, the youngest, snorted. "Sure thing, Miss Tokyo." His voice was thin but sharp as broken glass. Another soldier chuckled under his breath. "Careful, Hawkins. She might be with Tojo's ghost." Aiko didn't look up. She unfolded the gauze, dipped it in the teacup, and began cleaning the wound on Hawkins's forearm. He flinched at the first touch, not from pain, but from something colder, the thought of being touched by her. "You fought for the wrong side, he muttered. She paused only for a second, then quietly, "There are no sides in pain." He didn't answer. She finished the dressing, tied it neatly, and stood. Her reflection caught in the metal bed frame, eyes tired, lips pressed tight, hair tucked perfectly into the nurse's cap. The hospital uniform hung a little loose on her frame. She had lost weight. She had lost more than that, but no one here cared to know. At the far end of the ward, a radio crackled. The Liberty-class freighter Jonathan Pierce suffered minor hull fracture today upon arrival. Naval engineers suspect structural fatigue in the midsection. Authorities assure. The nurse at the front desk turned the volume down before the report finished, but the words had already reached her. Hull fracture, structural fatigue. She knew those words not from nursing school, but from her father's workshop in Tokyo. He had been a ship welder before the firebombing. He used to hold her small hand against the steel and say, "Listen, steel has a heartbeat. It hums when it's whole. It goes silent when it's afraid." Aiko remembered that silence, the night the sky burned and the factory fell. "Takeda!" The sharp voice pulled her back. Chief Nurse Donovan stood by the doorway, arms folded. "You're needed in Ward 3. Captain Wallace's dressing change." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to leave, but Hawkins called after her. "Hey, why you doing this, huh? Helping us?" His tone wasn't mocking this time. It was genuine confusion, the kind that trembled between fear and guilt. Aiko looked at him, eyes steady. "Because steel can break, so can people. But we can mend." The room went quiet. Only the radio whispered, the sea sighing beyond the walls. Ward 3 smelled different, older, heavier. The man on the bed was gray-haired, maybe in his 50s, with a beard that looked like it had grown through pain. His name tag read E. F. Carson, Chief Engineer. The chart by his bed listed burns on the left arm, mild concussion, and fractured ribs. Aiko approached quietly, preparing the bandages. He was awake, eyes half open, studying her the way engineers study pressure gauges without trust, but with focus. "You Japanese?" he asked, voice dry. "Yes." He stared at the ceiling for a while, then said, "Figures." He turned his head slightly, revealing a small leather-bound notebook half hidden under his pillow. The corner of a page was stained with oil and salt. Aiko recognized the handwriting from afar, tight, exact, numbers and symbols arranged like small machines. Blueprints. When she reached to move the pillow, he snapped, "Don't touch that. I only changed dressing." He watched her work, eyes following every motion. "You know what this is?" he asked suddenly, tapping the notebook. "A record?" she replied. "A post-mortem," he said flatly, "of a ship that cracked itself to death." Her hand hesitated. "Cracked?" He nodded once, eyes drifting toward the window, where the sea shimmered pale and merciless. "They built her to last forever, called her unbreakable. But she didn't bend. She snapped." Aiko felt her breath catch. He wasn't talking about just a ship. When she finished, she placed the clean bandage gently over his arm. The gesture was small, but something passed between them, an understanding made not of words, but of fractures seen from opposite shores. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon a folded newspaper by the bedside. The headline read, "Victory ships replace Liberty class. Stronger, faster, unbreakable." She lingered on the word unbreakable until it blurred. Then she placed the teacup back on the tray, bowed slightly, and whispered, "Nothing that refuses to bend ever truly lasts." Outside, the sea kept breathing slow, endless, and tired. The next morning began with fog, the kind that made the bay disappear. From the nurses' quarters, Aiko could hear the shipyard horns calling to one another through the mist, long, low, and mournful, like whales searching for something they had lost. She poured hot water into her chipped teacup, the same one she'd used in the ward. Steam rose in soft curls, blurring her reflection in the window. For a second, she imagined it was her father's breath again, fogging up his welding goggles as he leaned over a seam of glowing steel. Then came the knock. "Aiko, you're wanted at the docks. Captain Wallace's orders." It was Nurse Donovan's voice, brisk, commanding. "You'll be assisting with the transfer of wounded engineers. Ship's name, Jonathan Pierce. Try not to faint at the sight of steel." Aiko nodded silently. She placed the teacup down and tucked a clean handkerchief into her pocket habit, not vanity. The cotton square had her initials sewn in faint gray thread, AT, the same as her father's marking on his welding apron. The dock was alive with sound. Winches clanked, cranes creaked, gulls screamed overhead. The Jonathan Pierce loomed like a wounded animal, paint scraped, hull patched, salt crusted along its seams. Near the midsection, a black scar traced the steel like a healed wound. Aiko froze. The pattern was familiar. She had seen something like it before in a photograph smuggled through the war, of a ship called SS Schenectady, snapped clean in two. A young man was shouting at a team of mechanics nearby. "Keep the acetylene steady, damn it! We're patching, not painting." He was broad-shouldered, his uniform still creased, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. The name on his tag read, Lieutenant Daniel Reeves. He noticed her standing by the railing. "You're the nurse?" "Yes." "You're early. Good." He handed her a clipboard, smudged with graphite. "We've got 5 injured, mostly flash burns. The rest are jumpy as hell. Ship almost broke her back again last night." "Again?" He exhaled, rubbing a scar at his temple. "Crack under frame 37, not full fracture, thank God. But you can feel her shiver when the engines start, like she remembers." That word again. Crack. Aiko didn't answer. She followed him aboard, stepping onto the deck that groaned softly under her feet. Below deck, the air was dense with oil and salt. The wounded lay in hammocks strung between beams. One man's face was bandaged completely. Another had his arm splinted with metal rods. Reeves pointed to the first patient. "Sergeant Lane, burned during welding inspection. Gas leak." Aiko knelt beside him, unwrapping the gauze. The wound was angry and raw, red with heat. She dabbed antiseptic gently. The man stirred. "Where am I?" he whispered. "Safe," she said. His eyes fluttered open. "You ain't American." "No," he swallowed. "Then why help us?" She met his gaze cloudy, uncertain, and replied, "Because pain doesn't speak a language." He smiled weakly. "Maybe it should." After tending to the wounded, Reeves gestured toward the bulkhead. "You ever see something like this?" Aiko followed him to the outer hull. A long, jagged line cut through the steel plate, thin as a hair, but running nearly the full height of the ship. Welded patches gleamed silver in the dim light. He tapped it with his wrench. That's the problem. Welds run too long, no rivets to stop the stress. When it gets cold, the steel snaps. Like glass. Like heart, Aiko murmured. He gave a short laugh. "You talk like a poet. We just call it bad metallurgy." She looked at the scar again, tracing the smooth curve of the weld. "In Japan, my father say, if you don't let the metal breathe, it dies from inside." Reeves studied her, curiosity softening his tone. "Your old man was a welder?" "Yes, before the fire." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps even regret. "Guess we both inherited ghosts." They stepped out on deck again. The fog had lifted a little, revealing cranes like skeletons against the pale sky. On the pier, Captain Wallace waited tall, thin, wrapped in a dark coat. Beside him stood Engineer Carson, the gray-haired man from Ward 3. When Carson saw Aiko, he nodded slightly. "You again?" "Yes, sir." Reeves lowered his voice. "You know him?" "He was my patient." Carson spoke without looking at either of them. "She knows more than most of my crew about how things break." Aiko flinched. She wasn't sure if it was an insult or a compliment. Wallace gestured toward the hull. "We're moving her to dry dock tomorrow, but the Navy's breathing down our necks for a report. They want to know why these Liberty hulls keep cracking like eggs." Carson exhaled. "Because we rushed them. Because we welded like we were racing the devil. And because steel doesn't forget." Aiko looked between them. The wind tugged at her sleeve, carrying the scent of salt and rust. Reeves frowned. "You sound like her, Chief." Carson gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe she's the only one listening." That night, back in her quarters, Aiko couldn't sleep. The foghorns had gone quiet, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock and the hum of distant machinery. She sat by the window, sketching on the corner of a paper napkin. A line, a curve, a circle that never closed. Each stroke reminded her of her father's last lesson. When you weld, never start and end at the same point. Leave a space. Let it breathe. She placed the napkin beside her teacup and whispered, "Are we breathing now, Father, or still cracking?" Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic groan from the shipyard as if the sea itself answered. The next day dawned with rain that fell in steady threads, sewing the sky to the sea. The Jonathan Pierce rested in dry dock like a patient under surgery lights. Sparks leapt from acetylene torches, showering the ground in orange fireflies. Aiko stood at the railing, coat buttoned high, watching the engineers peel away a section of the hull. Carson joined her, a clipboard tucked under one arm, his breath visible in the cold air. "You're early," he said. "So are you." He gave a short laugh. "Couldn't sleep. Too much steel in my head." She smiled faintly. "I know that sound." He looked at her curious. "You ever work the yards?" "No, but I grew up in Yokohama. Every morning, my father's hammer sang before the roosters did." Carson nodded, eyes distant. "Then you know the rhythm. Steel's a stubborn thing. You push it too fast, it sings out of tune." Below them, the welders paused, shouting over the rain. A section of metal, blackened by corrosion, had split clean across. It looked almost deliberate, as though someone had drawn a knife through the hull. Carson swore under his breath. There it is again. The damn brittle fracture. Look at the angle, see the straight edge? That's not fatigue. That's temperature shock. He leaned closer, tracing the crack with a gloved finger. Same pattern as Schenectady, 1943. Same cold, same alloy. We never learned. Aiko felt a strange chill crawl down her spine. In the silence between hammer strikes, the sound of the rain became a whisper, like someone breathing through the steel. Inside the engineer's cabin, Carson spread diagrams over the table blueprints warped by water stains and grease. A small radio on the shelf played faint jazz from Portland. "I'll be seeing you." Its melody drifted like smoke. Aiko poured coffee into 2 enamel cups, setting one beside him. The motion mirrored what she used to do for her father: pour, stir, wait. Carson sipped, grimaced. "Burnt, but it'll do." He pointed at the diagram. "See this angle here? 90 degrees at the cargo hatch. Every time a wave hits, the stress doubles at that corner. Add cold, add welding strain snap." She studied the page. "In Japan, we learned from temple builders. No right angles in the heart of a structure. Always curve, let energy flow." Carson looked at her for a long moment. "Guess faith and physics finally agree." She didn't smile. "Faith broke too." He frowned slightly, sensing the weight behind her words, but choosing not to pry. Instead, he tapped the metal ruler against the blueprint. "I told them once, if you weld everything shut, you leave no room for forgiveness. Steel needs forgiveness." Aiko looked up. "So do people." The radio crackled, the singer's voice dissolving into static. Carson turned the dial, but only found silence. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. By evening, the investigation deepened. Reeves joined them with a set of inspection reports. "Captain wants this signed by morning. Navy's asking if we can guarantee no further fractures." Carson snorted. "Guarantee? You might as well ask a priest to promise no more sins." Reeves dropped the folder on the table. "Then what the hell do I tell them?" Aiko glanced at the papers. "Tell them truth bends slower than steel." Reeves blinked. "Meaning?" Carson translated softly. "Meaning nothing's perfect, but it can still hold." A silence followed. Somewhere below, a welder's torch hissed out, leaving only the rain. Reeves rubbed his temples. "You two talk like poets. I just want this damn ship to float." "Then let it breathe," Aiko said quietly. He stared at her, half in confusion, half in respect. "You sound like my father when he prayed before launching a ship." She tilted her head. "Did it work?" "Sometimes." Later that night, Aiko walked alone along the dock, lantern in hand. The sea had calmed, but the tide left streaks of salt on the concrete. She stopped before the Jonathan Pierce, its reflection trembling in the puddles. Her breath fogged in the cold. She pressed a hand against the hull's smooth surface, cool, unyielding. "I wish we could mend hearts like this," she whispered. The hull groaned softly, a long, drawn-out note. The sound vibrated through her palm, through the rainwater, into her bones. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard a voice within it, a deep echo, words shaped not by mouth, but by memory. "Leave a space. Let it breathe." She stepped back, trembling. The lantern flame flickered wildly. Behind her, Carson approached, his boots echoing on the wet dock. "You all right?" "Yes, just listening." He followed her gaze toward the ship. "Funny, sometimes I think they talk to us. All the ships we built too fast, too proud. They're just trying to tell us where it hurts." Aiko nodded. "Then maybe we should listen harder." He smiled faintly. "You ever think of joining the engineering corps?" She looked at him, half amused. "I mend flesh, not steel." "Same thing," he said. "Both break in silence before they ever scream." Hours later, back in her room, Aiko unfolded the paper napkin she'd drawn on the one from the night before. She added a new line, a curve beneath the break, a shape like a wave carrying the crack upward. She set it beside the teacup, and turned on the radio. The signal hissed, then resolved into a faint hymn, "Abide with me." Her eyes closed. Somewhere beyond the window, the ship's lights blinked once, twice, then dimmed as if the Jonathan Pierce was breathing again. Rain turned to frost overnight. The Jonathan Pierce gleamed beneath a thin film of ice, her hull lit by floodlights that cut through the dawn haze. The dock was nearly silent except for the rhythmic hiss of steam rising from the welders' torches. Aiko arrived early, as usual. The air smelled of burnt metal and coffee left too long on the stove. She carried her small thermos, its lid polished smooth from years of use, her father's old one. Inside the shed, Carson was hunched over a steel plate. A circular sample, freshly cut from the hull, lay on the table, riddled with hairline cracks like veins on old porcelain. "Morning," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Morning. You ever wonder how something this thick can break from the inside out?" Aiko poured him a cup of coffee. "People do that every day." He paused, meeting her eyes, tired, bloodshot. "You really think we're any different from the ships we build?" She shrugged. "We carry too much weight, go too fast, never cool down. Then one day, we split." Carson chuckled grimly. "You're wasted as a nurse." Reeves entered, shaking frost from his cap. "Captain Wallace wants a demonstration by noon. He's bringing the Navy auditors." Carson frowned. "Demonstration?" "They want proof the modifications will hold rounded corners, crack arresters, all that fancy talk. We weld, we test, we pray it doesn't explode." Aiko's gaze flicked toward the furnace where a steel plate glowed faintly red. "And if it does, then we start over," Carson said quietly. Reeves forced a grin. "Or they shut us down." The radio on the shelf buzzed to life, static breaking through. A calm male voice read the morning bulletin. "Temperatures along the Oregon coast expected to drop below freezing. Shipyard safety advisories remain in effect. The U.S. Maritime Commission reminds—" Carson switched it off. "They remind us after the ships crack, never before." By mid-morning, the test began. The team gathered around the steel plate clamped in a hydraulic press, a miniature replica of the ship's hull joint, welded with new crack arresters. Aiko stood at the edge, notebook in hand, recording each pressure increment. Carson called out numbers. 100 pounds, 200, 6, 8. At 900, a faint ping echoed. Everyone froze. Reeves leaned forward. "Was that not failure?" Carson muttered. "It's breathing." He adjusted the gauge. Again. The sound came again, sharper this time, a dry metallic sigh. The weld held, but a fine frost line crept across the surface. "Cold fracture," Carson whispered. Aiko moved closer, touching the steel with her gloved hand. The metal was cold enough to bite. Her voice was calm, almost reverent. "It's afraid." Reeves exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Steel doesn't feel, nurse." "Then why does it scream before it breaks?" Carson turned sharply to her, then back to the sample. "She's right. Listen." The room fell silent. The steel emitted a soft ticking, like the beat of a faint heart. Then, suddenly, a crack, small but clear. The plate split along an invisible seam, not at the weld, but through the old material. Reeves cursed. "Damn it!" Carson's eyes widened. "It's the steel itself. Too brittle at low temp. They kept using the same batch." He grabbed a file from the table, pulling out the supply manifest. "Lot 42C, the same used in Schenectady. Someone ignored the MIT report." Aiko frowned. "Why would they?" Reeves hesitated. "Because changing alloy costs time. Time we don't have in war." Carson's jaw tightened. "So they built ships like coffins and called it victory." The silence afterward was heavy. The frost on the window caught the light, fracturing it into cold prisms. After the auditors left, unimpressed and unconvinced, the three sat in the empty workshop. The radio hummed faintly again, playing an old gospel tune, "Hold to God's unchanging hand." Reeves broke the silence first. "Captain says if we can't prove stability by next week, they'll scrap Pierce." Carson didn't answer. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but fury. Aiko refilled his coffee. "You should rest." He shook his head. "Rest won't fix steel, or men who lie about it." She folded her white napkin neatly, placing it beside the test plate. The small gesture drew his attention. "What's that for?" "Clean start," she said. "In my country, before rebuilding, we always wipe the dust. It reminds us not to carry the old cracks forward." Reeves looked between them, uneasy. "And if the crack's inside?" Aiko smiled sadly. "Then we learn to listen before it grows." Night fell early. The workshop lights cast long shadows over the floor, stretching like fractures through the cold air. Aiko lingered by the window, gazing at the frozen bay. Carson joined her. Exhaustion etched into his face. "You know what I keep hearing when the hull groans? Not the metal, the men who built it." She turned to him. "Maybe they were singing, not groaning." He shook his head. "No, it's guilt, Aiko. Every time one of these Liberty hulls cracked in two, I wondered if it was my weld." Her voice softened. "Guilt means you still care. Care doesn't bring ships home. Neither does denial." He looked at her, then really looked as if seeing something beyond her nurse's uniform. The lantern light caught the reflection in her eyes, small and steady like molten metal before it cools. "You sound like my conscience," he said. She smiled faintly. "Then listen before it breaks, too." When he left, Aiko returned to her table. She unfolded her napkin again, the same one she'd been sketching on for nights. This time, she drew not a crack, but a curve, a soft arc bridging two halves of steel. Beneath it, she wrote in neat, deliberate letters, "Let it breathe." The radio clicked softly, the hymn fading into static. The ship outside groaned in the dark, as if echoing her words back through the cold. The fog rolled in from the bay, swallowing the docks in a cold, gray silence. At the far end of the pier, the Jonathan Pierce loomed like a ghost, her black hull stitched with weld seams that glistened under the floodlights. Each seam, a promise. Each promise, a potential lie. Inside the workshop, Carson was already pacing when Aiko arrived. The smell of acetylene hung thick in the air. Reeves sat at the bench, flipping through a folder stamped U.S. Maritime Commission, confidential. Carson slammed his palm against the table. "They're covering it up." Reeves looked up, weary. "Keep your voice down." "They falsified the tensile results. Lot 42C again brittle steel, but the report says safe for service. I cross-checked the stamp marks myself." Reeves sighed, rubbing his temples. "You think I don't know? We've been told to use it anyway. Orders came straight from the Navy." "Orders don't make bad steel good," Carson snapped. Aiko quietly poured tea into 3 chipped mugs. "What will you do?" Carson's hands trembled slightly as he took the cup. "I'll tell the auditors. They can't ignore physical evidence." Reeves's voice dropped to a warning whisper. "You tell them, and you're finished. They'll blacklist you from every shipyard on the coast." Carson stared into the rising steam. "Then I'll weld fences for farmers, but I won't build another coffin." Later that morning, a delegation arrived. 2 naval officers in pressed uniforms and Captain Wallace, their stern, clean-shaven supervisor. His eyes scanned the shop like a hawk. "Gentlemen," Wallace said curtly, "we're conducting a live stress test today. 1/4 hull panel, preheated welds, same procedure as Portland." Carson frowned. "Sir, that alloy's unstable at sub-zero temperature. We need to—" "Proceed as instructed, Mr. Carson," Wallace cut in. "We have a schedule, not a sermon." Reeves nodded obediently. Carson said nothing. Aiko watched the exchange from the sidelines, feeling the tension coil tighter around the room. She noticed Wallace's gloved hands. The fingertips were immaculate, untouched by work. Yet on his lapel, pin gleamed a tiny engraving, "Victory through industry." She thought of her father, his hands blistered and burned, holding steel in place as it cooled. Victory, she thought, was a word that never fit the wounded. By noon, the test chamber was ready. A heavy steel panel was mounted inside the containment frame. The welds Carson's ran smooth and flawless along the curve. The team retreated behind the glass wall as pressure valves hissed to life. The gauge climbed. 200 psi, 400, 600. "Hold steady," Carson murmured. At 900 psi, a faint whine began, the same sound as before, the steel's breath. Aiko closed her eyes, counting the rhythm. Wallace stood with arms crossed. "Increase to 1100. Carson hesitated. "Sir, we're at the limit." "Do it." He turned to Reeves. "Pressure up." Reeves's hand hovered over the lever, sweat beading on his brow. Aiko could see the war in his face, obedience versus fear. Finally, he pulled it. The gauge needle jumped. The steel groaned like a living thing. Then came the crack, sudden, sharp, like lightning trapped in metal. The panel split down the center. The containment glass shook violently. A jet of steam burst through the seam, scattering shards of metal across the floor. Everyone ducked. Aiko covered her head with her arms, the tea mug shattering beside her. Silence followed thick, ringing silence. When the steam cleared, the welds were still intact. The fracture had cut through the plate itself, not the weld. Carson stood motionless. "There's your proof," he said hoarsely. "It's the steel, not the weld." Wallace's face hardened. "This test never happened. Recorders off. Notes destroyed." Carson stepped forward. "You can't hide this." The captain's voice dropped low. "You're a civilian contractor. You have no authority." Aiko rose, voice trembling but clear. "He's right. You can't hide truth under paint." Wallace's gaze turned to her. "Miss Takeda, your position here is delicate. I suggest you remember that." The words hung in the air like a blade. After the officers left, Carson sat at his desk, staring at the broken test plate. Reeves stood by the door, chain-smoking in silence. "They'll destroy the reports," Reeves muttered. Carson nodded. "And the next ship will crack in the open sea again." Aiko knelt beside the plate, tracing the fracture line with her finger. The edge was jagged, glinting like frozen lightning. "It didn't break at the weld," she said softly. "It broke where the steel was oldest, where it carried memory." Carson looked at her, puzzled. "In my village," she continued, "when a pot breaks, we fill the cracks with gold. Kintsugi, we call it. It doesn't hide the break, it honors it." He frowned. "That's art. This is engineering." "Maybe they're the same," she said. "Both are ways to keep something from being lost." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled, the first real smile in weeks. "Maybe we should start filling ships with gold then." Reeves stubbed out his cigarette. At least then the Navy would pay attention. They laughed, briefly, but the sound was hollow. That night, the workshop was dark except for the faint glow of the furnace. Aiko sat alone, mending the torn edge of her white napkin, each stitch tight, deliberate. Through the wall, she could hear Carson's voice, low, urgent, dictating something into a recorder. Testing anomaly confirmed, fracture initiated below the weld, material failure due to... Then silence. She realized he was creating a duplicate report, one that told the truth. When he emerged, he looked exhausted but lighter. "If anything happens, the file's in locker B12. She nodded. "And if they find it?" Then maybe the truth cracks through, he said quietly. He left soon after. Aiko remained by the furnace, holding the napkin in her hands. The thread glowed faintly in the light, a thin golden line across white cloth. Outside, the bay wind howled, carrying the sound of the sea against the hull, groaning, breathing, alive. The sound of rain was steady, unbroken, like welding sparks against a cold hull. Outside, the yard cranes stood still, their silhouettes blurred by the mist. Inside the administrative wing of the shipyard, fluorescent lights hummed faintly, turning everyone's skin the color of old parchment. Aiko sat in a wooden chair before a steel desk. Her white uniform looked gray under the light. Across from her sat Captain Wallace, flanked by a Navy officer with the kind of face that remembered everything and forgave nothing. "Miss Takeda," Wallace began, voice clipped, "you were present during yesterday's test." "Yes." "You witnessed the fracture event." "Yes." He leaned forward slightly. "And you claim it resulted from defective steel, not from faulty welds." Aiko folded her hands in her lap. "It broke in the plate, not the seam." The officer beside him made a note in his ledger. "Do you have engineering qualifications, Miss Takeda?" "I studied welding with my father before the war." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Your father? In Japan?" "Yes." A pause. The officer set down his pen. "So you were raised in an enemy nation, trained by an enemy welder, and now you're making claims about U.S. Navy steel." "I'm not making claims," she said softly. "I'm describing what I saw." The silence that followed was colder than the rain. Wallace stood. "You'll refrain from further comment on this matter. Do you understand?" Aiko met his gaze. "If a ship sails with bad steel, men will die." His jaw tightened. "That's not your concern." "It is if I'm the one cleaning their wounds." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, irritation, or maybe guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Escort her back to the ward," he ordered. "She's done here." Carson was gone by the time she returned. His locker was open, stripped bare except for a few scattered bolts and a half-empty tobacco tin. A handwritten note lay on the bench, addressed to no one. If truth breaks the hull, maybe it keeps the soul from sinking. Reeves found her reading it. He looked older somehow, the stubble on his face catching the weak afternoon light. "They let him go," he said quietly. "Officially, insubordination. Unofficially, he made them afraid." They stood in silence for a long while, the clatter of rain on the roof like faint applause from a faraway crowd. Reeves lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "He was right about the steel. I ran the numbers again. Transition temps too high for Atlantic ops. The next Liberty that hits cold water will split like glass." "Then report it." He shook his head. "You think anyone up there cares? The Navy wants victory ships, not excuses. Every delay is another convoy unarmed." "Is silence a kind of victory?" she asked. He looked away. "Sometimes it's survival." 2 days later, the shipyard hosted a press event. A new Victory-class freighter, SS Franklin Howe, stood gleaming on the slipway, flags snapping in the wind. Reporters swarmed like gulls. The air smelled of polish and propaganda. Aiko watched from behind the infirmary window as Wallace gave his speech. "These ships are stronger, faster, and built with the finest American steel. They represent not just engineering, but faith in our future." The crowd applauded. The band played. Cameras flashed. But as the champagne bottles shattered against the hull, Aiko saw a small line of sweat trickle down Reeves's temple. He was standing by the engine room hatch, clipboard in hand. His eyes met hers for a second, long enough for her to see the crack forming, not in metal, but in conscience. That evening, Reeves came to her quarters. His uniform smelled faintly of oil and rain. "I'm leaving," he said. "Transfer to Long Beach." "You're running." He didn't deny it. There's talk about me, about the test. I won't survive another inquiry. She studied him quietly. Carson left his notes, locker B12. He blinked. You read them? Yes. He kept copies of the pressure data and a list of steel batches marked unsafe. If those ships sail, I know. You can still send them to the commission, anonymously. He gave a humorless laugh. You think truth travels faster than orders? She stepped closer, her voice almost a whisper. It only needs to travel far enough to reach someone who listens. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to measure how much belief a person could hold before it became dangerous. Then he exhaled. If I send them, and they trace it back to me, then let them, she said. You'll have done something that bends before it breaks. He stared at the floor for a moment, then nodded slowly. That night, the shipyard was empty except for the echo of waves against concrete. Reeves slipped into the control office, the key to locker B12 cold in his hand. Inside was a single manila envelope, stamped Private Log, E.F. Carson. He opened it under the desk lamp. Pages of diagrams, temperature curves, and brittle fracture notes. At the bottom, a photograph, a close-up of the test plate from the explosion. The crack ran clean through the steel, like a fault line across the world. Reeves hesitated only a second before feeding the pages through the telecopy machine. The transmission light flickered weakly, then steadied a tiny heartbeat pulsing against darkness. The next morning, Aiko found an envelope slipped beneath her door. Inside was a single line, typed on coarse paper. Report delivered. Hope it finds someone with ears. R. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her uniform pocket. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky, for the first time in days, was pale blue. In the harbor, the Franklin Howe was preparing for sea trials. Crewmen shouted, ropes were drawn, and engines hummed like a rising prayer. Aiko stood on the pier and watched her depart, sunlight catching the curve of the hull, making it look flawless. But she knew better. Perfection was only what light allowed you to see. As the ship moved away, the wind carried a low, deep groan, the sound of steel remembering its own limits. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Bend, don't break." The wind off the Columbia River carried a taste of salt and ironed the smell of something about to begin. At dawn, SS Franklin Howe slipped down the channel, engines thrumming like a heartbeat beneath her steel skin. Aiko stood on the pier with her medical kit, part of the ship's first aid crew assigned for sea trials. The sunlight made the hull shimmer silver, masking the seams that had cost so many sleepless nights. Reeves appeared beside her, his uniform damp with spray. "You don't have to come," he said. "I volunteered," she replied. "If it breaks, I'll be there." He looked at her not with surprise, but with the kind of quiet respect reserved for people who had already chosen their danger. The harbor fell away behind them, replaced by the rolling gray of the Pacific. Inside the test cabin, gauges hummed, pencils trembled on clipboards, and the radio spat out bursts of static between weather updates. "Speed 12 knots," called the helmsman. Reeves checked his stopwatch. "Maintain course 180. Record pressure differentials every 10 minutes. Aiko sat by the infirmary desk, the same white tablecloth from the ward folded neatly in her lap. It wasn't regulation, but she'd brought it anyway, a small act of order against the chaos of machinery. Beside it lay a steel toothbrush case and a half-eaten slice of apple pie from breakfast. Objects of life, fragile among engines. By mid-morning, the ship met heavier seas. Waves slammed against the hull, echoing through the corridors like muffled thunder. The metal groaned a long, low complaint. Reeves frowned. "Did you hear that?" "Expansion noise?" asked the helmsman. "Maybe." But he didn't sound convinced. He went below to inspect the bulkhead seams. Aiko followed, the sound of her boots ringing sharp against the steel grating. Down in the lower compartment, the air was heavy with diesel and humidity. Condensation beaded on the walls like sweat. Reeves ran his hand along a welded joint near the midsection. "This area is under the most stress," he murmured. The test plates were from the same batch Carson flagged. The ship tilted, a slow, deliberate motion that made both of them reach for balance. A hairline vibration sang through the floor. "That's not normal," Aiko said quietly. Reeves grabbed a flashlight and aimed it along the seam. The beam caught something, a faint, jagged line spreading from the corner of a hatch frame. Aiko's breath caught. Crack! "Keep your voice down," he warned. "They'll shut us down before we can prove anything." He pulled out his notebook, sketching the line's position, then pressed a small ruler against it. The mark grew almost imperceptibly as the ship rolled again. "How long before it fails?" she asked. He shook his head. "Could be hours. Could be minutes." Above deck, the wind screamed louder. Crewmen fought to secure cables as the sea began to rise. The sky had turned to pewter, and seagulls vanished into the fog. Reeves burst onto the bridge, soaked and pale. "Captain, we need to reduce speed. Hull stress readings are spiking." Captain Wallace turned, face unreadable. "Sea trials require full load. We maintain schedule. The lower plates are showing deformation." "Speculation," Wallace cut him off. "No confirmed failure." Reeves slammed his palm on the chart table. "Sir, I saw the crack myself." The captain's eyes hardened. "Then you'll also remember your duty to confidentiality. This ship carries the Navy's new certification team. You want to embarrass them?" "It's not embarrassment I'm worried about," Reeves said. "It's gravity." Aiko stood by the hatch, drenched and shivering, the tablecloth clutched in her hands. "He's right," she said softly. "The steel is breaking." The captain turned to her with cold precision. "You're a nurse, not an engineer. Return to your station." Reeves stepped forward. "If you keep this course, the hull could tear in two." Wallace leaned closer, his breath hot with anger. "And if I turn back, the Navy tears me in two." "Do you understand the math of obedience, Lieutenant?" Reeves didn't answer. Outside, thunder rolled deep, relentless, like a god knocking on the door of metal. By afternoon, the storm hit full. Waves towered over the bow. The radio sputtered with interference. Somewhere deep below, a dull bang echoed, not the rhythm of engines, but the sound of something giving way. The deck lurched violently. Men shouted. Papers flew. The lights flickered. Reeves grabbed the rail. "That's the midsection!" Aiko steadied herself against the infirmary door, heart pounding. Instruments crashed to the floor. A tray of medical tools clattered, scattering like dice. The tablecloth slipped free, unfolding across the steel floor white against gray, trembling in the draft. Then came the second sound, sharper, crueler, like the world itself cracking. Reeves ran to the intercom. "Engine room! Shut down turbines! We've got structural compromise amidships!" No reply, only static. He turned to Aiko. "Get the crew topside. Lifeboats ready." She nodded, clutching her bag and the white cloth, as if both could hold something together. On the deck, chaos reigned. Rain slashed sideways. Men wrestled with ropes, their boots sliding on wet metal. The ship's bow lifted, then slammed down, sending a shock through the entire frame. Aiko moved through the turmoil, binding wounds, shouting directions, dragging one sailor clear of a fallen beam. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her hands were raw. Reeves appeared again, blood streaking his forehead. "Cracks spreading toward the fuel compartment," he shouted. "We've got 10 minutes." She met his eyes, calm, steady. "Then we use them." Together, they moved to the communication room. Reeves seized the transmitter. "Mayday, Mayday, this is SS Franklin Howe. Hull breach amidships. Coordinates. Gee. The line cut out. Power gone. Eiko reached for the emergency lantern. Its faint orange glow revealed the white tablecloth, now streaked with grease and blood. She spread it across the table, pressing down the trembling edges with both hands, a futile, tender act against the storm. Reeves watched her, chest heaving. Why do that? Because something should stay clean, she said, even if we don't. Minutes later, the order came. Abandon ship. Crew scrambled into lifeboats as waves tore at the railings. Reeves helped Eiko climb down, the wind ripping the breath from their mouths. Below, the sea raged black, immense, indifferent. They rode clear just as the midsection buckled. The ship bent in two, a slow-motion bow before disappearing beneath foam and smoke. No explosion, just the long, terrible sound of surrender. In the silence that followed, Eiko stared at the empty sea. Pieces of the ship floated past a broken ladder, a toolbox, the corner of a white cloth drifting like a ghost. Reeves whispered, "We warned them." She didn't answer. Her eyes followed the cloth until it vanished beneath the waves. Then, quietly, she said, "Steel remembers." At dawn, rescue vessels found them shivering survivors amid debris. Official reports would later describe SS Franklin Howe as lost to unexpected weather. No mention of the fracture, no record of the warnings. But weeks later, an anonymous envelope arrived at the Maritime Commission in Washington. Inside were photos, notes, and a single sentence typed in capital letters. Bend, don't break. No signature, just a faint smear of salt water on the paper, as if the sea itself had tried to testify. 3 days after the wreck, the survivors were brought to Astoria under gray skies. Reporters waited on the dock, pencils ready, flashbulbs bright. But the Navy officers formed a wall, ushering the men past questions and into black cars. "Mechanical failure," one officer told the press. "Storm surge," said another. No one used the word crack. Eiko sat in the infirmary tent near the water's edge. Her hands trembled as she wrapped a bandage around Reeves's shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but he winced as if it burned through to the bone. "They already filed the report," he said quietly. "No mention of the weld seam, no mention of us." Eiko tied the knot carefully. "Then we write our own." Reeves gave a bitter smile. "And send it to whom? The same people who erased it the first time?" She didn't answer. The tent flapped in the wind, smelling of iodine and seaweed. In the distance, cranes lifted wreckage from the water-torn metal, mangled cables, the twisted bones of the Franklin Howe. That night, a soft knock came at Eiko's tent. She opened it to find Mr. Carson, the metallurgist who had once warned about the brittle steel. His coat was soaked through, his face drawn. "They told me you survived," he said. "I had to see you." Inside, he laid a folder on the table. "These are my test results, the ones they wouldn't let me file. Charpy impact data, fracture toughness curves. Every sample failed below freezing temperature." Eiko stared at the graphs. The lines dipped sharply, like cliffs falling into the sea. This proves everything." Carson nodded grimly. "I've tried to send it up the chain. Each time, the report disappears. The war board's too deep in contracts, they can't afford a scandal." Reeves stepped forward. "So they'll build more ships from the same steel." Carson's voice broke. "They already are." A week later, the survivors were summoned to a closed hearing in Portland. Eiko and Reeves sat in a narrow room before 3 officers and a civilian in a gray suit who didn't give his name. A stenographer clicked behind them, every keystroke sharp as a hammer. The chairman began. "Lieutenant Reeves, Miss Eiko Tanaka, your cooperation is appreciated. For the record, state the cause of the incident as you understand it." Reeves took a breath. Hull fracture due to brittle failure under low temperature. Improper alloy content. The chairman raised an eyebrow. You're certain? Yes, sir. We inspected the seam before failure. And this observation was recorded? Reeves hesitated. No photographic record, only field notes. The civilian leaned forward. Then it's your word against weather conditions, Lieutenant. The Navy's analysis cites wave stress, not material defect. Aiko spoke up, her voice calm but steady. The metal failed like glass. That's not weather, that's chemistry. Silence. The officers exchanged looks. Finally, the chairman closed his folder. Thank you. That will be all. You're both advised not to discuss classified trials publicly. The report is sealed under wartime security. Reeves clenched his fists. You mean buried. The chairman's eyes hardened. Dismissed. Outside, rain fell again, thin, relentless, like the sea's echo. Aiko looked up at the gray courthouse and whispered, They'll let it happen again. Reeves lit a cigarette, the flame shaking in his hand. Not if someone leaks it. She turned to him sharply. That would be treason. He exhaled smoke. Then let history call it what it wants. For days they planned in silence in rented rooms, in cafes near the shipyards. Carson gave them copies of his data. Aiko typed up her notes from the infirmary. Locations of fractures, witness statements, even the exact coordinates of the sinking. They didn't sign the report. They only titled it, Anonymous Observation, Structural Failures in Liberty-class Hulls. They wrapped it in brown paper, sealed it with wax, and mailed it to the Maritime Commission, Congressional Oversight, and one more, the New York Times. When it was done, Reeves said quietly, If this goes wrong, we'll both disappear. Aiko looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall, silent and pure. Then let the truth have our names, she said. Weeks passed. No one came for them. But the newspapers began whispering. Questions over Liberty ship losses. Anonymous engineers raise safety concerns. Senators demand inquiry. The Navy issued denials. Then quietly, orders were sent to reformulate the steel, to change the welding methods, to redesign the hull curves for flexibility. No one credited the whistleblowers. No one mentioned Aiko Tanaka or Robert Reeves. But in the yards along the Columbia, a new class of ships began to take shape, thicker plates, rounded joints, better metallurgy. They called them victory ships. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cranes, Reeves found Aiko sitting on the riverbank. She was sewing something small, a piece of white fabric with neat stitches across the torn edge. Is that the tablecloth? He asked softly. She nodded. I found part of it in the wreckage they brought back. Thought it deserved a second life. He sat beside her. The wind carried the smell of oil and salt, the same scent that had once meant danger. They'll never know what you did, he said. She smiled faintly. That's all right. The ships will. He looked at her hands, strong, scarred, but steady as they worked the needle through the cloth. Somewhere upriver, a new hull launched into the water with a deep, confident splash. The crowd cheered. Reeves and Aiko sat in silence, listening to the echo roll through the fog. Aiko whispered, Steel remembers, but so does Mercy. That night, in the quiet of her small, rented room, she opened her notebook and wrote one last entry. To bend is to live. To hide is to die. The sea forgives nothing, but it teaches everything. A.T. February 1944. Then she folded the cloth carefully, slipped the notebook inside, and placed both in a wooden box marked to be opened after the war. The moonlight fell across her face, tired, pale, but unbroken. Outside, ship horns sounded downriver, echoing like distant prayers. The winter of 1945 dragged on like a long breath held beneath gray skies. Factories hummed again, not for war, but for rebuilding. The victory ships were sliding down the slips smoother, stronger, almost graceful compared to their predecessors. Yet inside a modest boarding house near Pier 39, Aiko Takeda sat by a frost-blurred window, holding a fountain pen over a half-finished letter. Mother, the sea has taken much, but it has returned something too, the courage to mend what we once broke. Her hand trembled. She paused, the ink pooling in one corner of the page. Outside, a ship horn groaned through the fog. Aiko had written this letter 4 times before, each draft gentler, more careful, but none of them true enough. She wasn't sure what her mother wanted to hear, that her daughter had found peace in a foreign land, or that she'd become part of the very machinery that once destroyed theirs. On the table, beside her, sat the small wooden box she kept from the shipwreck inside it, the patched tablecloth, Reeves's field compass, and a few photographs half faded by seawater. The last photo showed a row of engineers in hard hats standing beside a Liberty ship hull. Reeves was there, smiling in the center, unaware of the thin seam line behind him that would one day split open like a wound. Later that evening, Reeves knocked on her door. He carried a thin envelope stamped Confidential, U.S. Maritime Commission. They cleared the new steel specs, he said, setting it down. Manganese rich, low carbon. Your report changed the curve, Aiko, even if no one knows it. She smiled faintly. Good steel remembers the lesson. He hesitated. And people? People forget faster, she said, eyes still on the letter. Reeves noticed the half-written page, the way she'd folded it, then unfolded it again, as if the words might breathe differently each time. Writing home? He asked. Yes, though I don't know if the address still exists. He nodded slowly. Sensors still screen anything to Japan. Might not make it through. I know, she said softly. Still some things are meant to be said, even if they never arrive. 2 weeks later, she mailed it anyway. The envelope carried no return address, only a small pressed camellia petal inside a silent symbol of remembrance. The letter traveled from San Francisco to Washington, then to the Pacific Mail Service, where piles of unsent correspondence from enemy nationals waited in a locked room. A clerk read the first lines, frowned, and placed it in the uncleared communications file. There it stayed, under dust, marked with a red stamp, not to be forwarded. Aiko never knew. That spring, the war crimes tribunals began. Tokyo burned again, not from bombs this time, but from the heat of judgment. Aiko followed the news in silence, her eyes tracing the black and white faces in the newspaper. Generals, officers, doctors. Men who had once believed steel and order could replace empathy. In one margin, she scribbled a note. Justice is not vengeance. It is the recalibration of truth. Reeves found her reading late one night. You still think truth can fix what war broke? She looked up. Truth doesn't fix. It reminds. That's enough. He leaned on the doorway. They offered me a position in the new commission, Metallurgy Division, Washington, D.C. I said I'd only go if you came too. Aiko smiled faintly. And what would I be? The conscience in the lab? Exactly that, he said. But her gaze wandered to the window, the sea beyond, the shipyard still lit by the orange glow of welding torches. I'm not ready to leave the water, she whispered. Every wave still sounds like a heartbeat. Months passed. The world moved on. Liberty ships were scrapped. Victory ships sailed east, and the war's scars turned into rusted relics. Aiko took work at a small rehabilitation clinic for sailors, stitching wounds and easing phantom pains. Some of her patients were Japanese Americans returning from camps. Others were American seamen haunted by what they'd seen in the Pacific. One patient, an old bosun, had a steel plate in his leg salvaged from a Liberty ship hull. It hums when it's cold, he told her with a grin, like it remembers the ocean. Aiko smiled gently. Maybe it does. At night, when the clinic quieted, She'd open her wooden box and read Reeves's short notes, sketches of ship designs, bits of poetry, a pressed clover between two sheets of graph paper. The compass no longer pointed north. Salt had corroded its needle, but she kept it anyway. Direction, she once told herself, isn't always about where to go. Sometimes it's about what to keep. In early summer, she received a notice. Reeves was leaving for Washington. He stopped by her clinic the day before departure, holding a brown envelope. "I wanted you to have this," he said. Inside was a photograph of Victory ship, sleek and bright, just launched. On the back, he'd written, "For every crack we sealed, one truth remained, that kindness outlasts steel." Aiko felt the sting of tears. "It's beautiful," she said, "but it's yours." "It's ours," he replied. "Every ship that doesn't break is part of your letter, even if it never reached its home." That night she went to the pier alone. Fog rolled in like breath on glass. She stood where the Franklin Howe had once docked, holding the patched tablecloth in her hands. Slowly, she tore one small corner from it the same way she used to tear gauze for her patients and let it fall into the water. It drifted away, a pale ghost on the tide. Aiko whispered, in Japanese, words her mother once told her after a storm. "Even if the boat is lost, the current remembers." The sea swallowed the fabric, quiet and sure. Weeks later, across the Pacific, a postal clerk in Yokohama opened a damaged shipment from San Francisco. Among the torn envelopes was a letter edges salt-stained, words blurred by time. The clerk couldn't read all of it, but one line remained clear. "To mend is to remember that nothing truly ends at the water's edge." He folded it carefully, placed it in a new envelope, and sent it onward, destination uncertain. No record remains whether it ever found her mother. But years later, in a small house rebuilt from ash, an old woman would light incense every August and whisper into the sea wind, "Thank you, my daughter, for learning to heal the iron that wounded us." San Francisco, 1961. The morning fog lifted slowly from the bay, revealing the hull of a ship that hadn't sailed for years, SS Redfield Victory, freshly painted and bound for the Maritime Museum, waited on its dry dock like an old veteran ready for one last salute. Inside the viewing deck, a small crowd gathered, engineers, students, veterans, and their children. Among them stood Aiko Takeda, her hair now silver-streaked, her coat buttoned against the chill. In her hand, she carried the same wooden box she had kept for 2 decades. A museum curator approached. "Miss Takeda, we're honored to have you here. Mr. Reeves mentioned you were part of the original metallurgy team?" She smiled. "A small part, but perhaps the right seam." He chuckled, not quite understanding. Moments later, a tall man stepped up to the microphone, Thomas Reeves, older now, with a cane and a slower voice, but the same steady eyes. 20 years ago, he began, we built ships out of fear of losing time, men and oceans. We welded steel too fast, too proud to notice its brittleness. But it was those cracks, not our victories, that taught us humility." He looked toward Aiko, their eyes meeting across the room. Reeves continued, "Some lessons come from the data we measure, others from the hands that mend what we've broken. Aiko taught me both." A murmur passed through the crowd. He motioned for her to join him on stage. At first, she hesitated. Then she stepped forward, the echo of her heels mingling with the sound of gulls outside. Reeves handed her a small torch. "Would you do the honor?" She nodded, pressed the ignition. A bright flame leapt up, and she touched it gently to the symbolic seam along the Victory ship's hull, a ceremonial weld to mark its preservation. For a moment, the blue-white light illuminated